Hi, welcome to BetterWorldians Radio. BetterWorldians Radio is a weekly broadcast whose mission is to uplift and inspire you to make the world a better place. I'm Ray Hansel, joined today by my co-hosts Mary Sue Hansel and Gregory Hansel. BetterWorldians Radio is brought to you by BetterWorldians Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to make the world a better place by encouraging the very best in everyone. We believe that the complex problems of our divisive world cannot be solved through negativity, blame, impulsiveness. Solutions present themselves when we adopt fresh ideas, optimistic attitudes, and innovative responses. The BetterWorldians approach is to educate, inspire, and motivate people with positive thinking, positive values, and positive actions. Joining us today on BetterWorldians Radio is William Issacs, founder of Dialogos, a management consulting and leadership development firm with offices in the United States and the UK. William is the author of Dialogue and the Art of Thinking Together. He is a leading authority on collective leadership, the design and development of organizational learning, and the practice of theory of dialogue. For more than 30 years, he has consulted to senior leaders of prominent organizations around the world.
Hi, Bill. This is Greg. Thanks for joining us today on BetterWorldians Radio.
Hi there.
So you and I were just chatting before the show, and I think everyone at home knows that we haven't seen things this divisive, in our culture at least, and maybe at the world at large, in quite a long time. There, people are at each other's throats, as we were saying, and laughing. People are screaming at each other and hoping that that's going to actually convince someone of anything. So that's what I'm hoping to talk about today, about how we can use dialogue to kind of get past this impasse and find a way forward beyond just hoping that suddenly screaming will convince someone of anything. Before we jump into that, can you tell our listeners a bit, though, about what you do at Dialogos?
Sure. We are a advisory and educational firm. We help leaders talk and think together, and those leaders can be entrepreneurs, development agency specialists, CEOs, prime ministers, physicians, you name it. We've worked in a lot of different people over the years, really right through the whole spectrum of organizations. And our vision has been to sort of discover and apply the principles of dialogue and of collective leadership. And I think we've, started to learn a few things at this point. Hopefully some of those things will be useful.
Interesting. Now, I know that you've done some work even around the world with world governments and dialogue. Can you speak to some of that? Yeah,
I mean, from many years, the focus we had was in the private sector in companies. Mm-hmm. And at some stage or other, we got a call from some people at a U.S. government agency, and ended up working with them for many years. And it began to be obvious that the principles that we were interested in applied well beyond the corporate world and sort of team building in companies. And one thing led to another, and we started working in partnership with the World Bank for a while in various different countries around the world, in Latin America, in South Asia, and in Central Europe, among others. And have now worked with prime ministers and cabinets to bring them together, advisors to prime ministers through all of the South Asia countries to talk about regional cooperation. The divisive political parties in Nepal we brought together at one point to talk about energy strategy and how to come together in a new way. And in each case, it's become clear that people who many experts would never want to interact, with not as much effort as might be believed, turn into being pretty good at doing it. And they sort of surprise themselves. There's some reasons for that, but there was a fellow, a central bank governor from Pakistan, who at one point, after one of our gatherings, said, "Look, we're a bunch of irascible South Asians, and we managed to come together. How did we do that?"
Well,
go ahead.
No, please.
Well, the implication was, if we can do it, Anybody can do it.
Right. Well, that's funny. I was about to say I find some hope in that because, if governments can come together and if political parties can come together, then maybe that means that we can try to find ways in the culture at large, the everyday folks at home trying to, find ways of talking to each other. So let me ask you, how can dialogue help break down these barriers and bring our communities together? There's just so much anger out there and just so much demonizing of difference. And how do we move forward?
Well, I think it's a very good question. It's obviously on everybody's minds. I mean, we're in a moment of polarization where it seems legitimate and necessary to make the other lose and make us win, and kind of any means necessary seems legitimate. And we're seeing this, I think, in national level contexts around the world in a way that a lot of people in this generation are getting quite nervous. There's a lot of studies of young people around the world who are quite depressed about the possibilities of the future. They're not optimistic, actually, kind of at all. And people are prone to hyperbole and saying, "Well, this is as bad as it's ever been." The truth of the matter is, I think that what we're experiencing might be unique for this generation, but I don't think it's unique for human beings.
Yeah.
I think that we have seen difficulties many times in, for instance, the United States. I live in a town in Massachusetts called Concord, which has a nice root. It means with the heart. And at least two different times in history, this country, this town has been a center point for people coming together that would not have normally done so, and in order to allow truly revolutionary transformations to take place. First, in the founding of the United States, in the Revolutionary War, there was a huge foment of activity that took a lot of, there was hardly any, there was a lot of lack of coherence, actually, at that time. And then also in the 1850s, this town was the location of the so-called American Transcendentalist movement. Emerson and Thoreau and Margaret Fuller and Thomas Carlyle and various other writers who recognized that something beyond the divisiveness in the country right around the time of the Civil War was needed. So I think people come together when the trouble arises and figure out what to do. So I think we may be in such a moment, so we have to figure out what to do.
Interesting. You just got me thinking about the Transcendentalists. I think it was Emerson who said, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. I'm wondering about a foolish consistency in our culture that, we just keep kind of beating the same dead horse of the way we treat each other and insistence on kind of a zero-sum, as you say, approach to, hey, they have to lose so we can win and our ideas can reign forever, this kind of thinking. So given the necessity of doing this, how do we cultivate an atmosphere where dialogue begins to be possible?
Well, I think there's a couple of somewhat unusual sounding premises that one has to sort of start with. One is that we use the word dialogue a lot. Everybody says, well, let's go have a dialogue. And
right.
The general definition is pretty much in the direction of let's talk. And when politicians sort of use the term, it usually means to people talking points. They're sort of selling something. It's not really what we mean by it. You said something about how to break down barriers. I think actually one of the premises here is we're not actually interested in breaking anything down. We're interested in understanding things. So the notion here is not to reach a new kind of agreement or find a new kind of compromise or dissolve differences. Nothing like that. Mm-hmm. It's to simply say, help me understand what is it that leads you to think the way you do.
Right.
And can I listen? And the second component of that, or twin component of that, you might say, is can I listen to what you might say without completely going crazy inside myself? Because often when we hear people say what they say or think what they think, it's quite maddening,
right,
and disturbing. And there's a part of us that wants to correct that or stop that or do something about that. Now, obviously, if what someone's doing is actually, creating true danger in some kind of physical sense, you might want to act. But if you're in a deliberate effort to build a different kind of exchange, then part of the challenge is to ask yourself, what would it take for me to listen without resisting what I'm hearing? Not agree, not modify, but not resist. It takes a bit of internal muscle to start to do that, and listening turns out to be a quite athletic activity. It's not something one just does. In fact, typically what we call listening is really much more what we would call projecting, which is to say you're putting your own ideas on what other people are saying. You're listening for how their facts confirm what you already think.
Right.
So it's very different to listen for real. And most everybody has had an experience somewhere in their life where they were really listened to, for real. We all probably have to think for a minute as to a time when that actually happened, because it doesn't happen as often as we'd all like.
Right.
But when it happens, it's profoundly liberating. And invariably, what you think changes. When that space of invitation is really present, your own tendency to exaggerate or make extreme or make a point diminishes. One of the challenges we've got is that we're in a moment where everything is polarized. Polarized means things are being brought to greater extremes than the people involved typically think. They may have a point of view, but when they get when they exchange or get into an encounter with someone who's, quote, different from them, their point of view gets yet more extreme and yet more divisive, and there's a feedback loop where everybody falls into that. So that doesn't work real well. So part of what we got to do is interrupt that.
So many fascinating bits of that. Just trying to unpack that. Pardon me. I love the notion of listening as an athletic activity, as an internal muscle. I've heard about research on willpower along the same lines, that you have to actually build up your willpower, and it is a muscle that you can grow. And it's interesting to the extent to which this kind of listening muscle has atrophied. I think that, we talk a lot about filter bubbles and confirmation biases these days, and, we're so used to getting our points of view confirmed in the kind of communities that we belong to, that I think it atrophies that listening muscle, because we are only listening to, as you say, we're projectively listening. We're waiting to hear someone acknowledge what we already think. So we say, okay, great, that sounds good. Let's move on. We're on the same page. And how difficult it is in that environment to really try to work that muscle out, to say, okay, I really need to just try to listen. How do you recommend that people start that process to truly, because, it's funny, you said, hey, sure, if someone is in danger, then maybe you need to take action. But of course, many people would say that the things in which there are fundamental disagreement with are, for some people, a nothing burger, as the parlance says these days, right? And for other people, they see it as a matter of life and death. So how do we find a way to listen when the stakes seem that high?
Yeah. Well, the stakes are very high. I think the issue is, so I think that's really important to state. Stakes are very high. Therefore, we should use approaches that work as opposed to ones that don't.
Yes.
In other words, if what works is to shout at each other or look for data, look for evidence of what we already think, and we should use that. Absolutely. There's pretty good evidence that doesn't work real well.
Yeah.
Actually, there's a favorite quote I have from Thomas Jefferson, where he says, I never saw an instance of one or two disputants convincing the other by argument. We don't argue our way into alignment. It doesn't happen. So the issue is what does work.
Right.
So I think interestingly, listening is quite a close cousin to confidence. What's really in short supply in the world is confidence. The sense that somehow I can navigate this rapidly changing, escalating world. It's not an incremental world we're in right now. It's an exponential world.
Yes.
And it's very easy to lose confidence in the face of that. And what happens in that experience is we cling to things that we think make us secure. Our point of view, our tribe, our argument, etc. And it has the unfortunate kind of shared experience of making other people feel less secure, which leads them to defend their point of view, which leads you to defend yours, and off we go. So it's part of what's needed is to start recognizing that what we need are some roots to generating and protecting our own confidence. And when you're confident, someone who differs with you is someone who's differing with you, not someone who's potentially threatening your entire way of life.
Right, not an existential threat.
They're just... Sorry?
No, please go ahead. I'm saying not an existential threat, just a difference.
No, it's a difference. And something that we all know at times anyway is that when you're confident, someone who has a difference can enhance your way of seeing things. In other words, if you start to realize that you may differ, but you also have the possibility of learning, your own point of view gets stronger, not weaker, if you listen. The fear is you'll lose and get weak, and therefore trouble arises. I think part of the dilemma here is that this appears to be some sort of mental argument you have to talk yourself into, when really confidence and listening and a few other things that we might get to are states of experience. They're not really techniques. I think one of the things that we've gotten ourselves a little bit confused about is we have the idea that, if we do a certain thing in a certain way, we'll get the result. And it's a very practical sounding idea, except for the small problem that what's needed is a different kind of experience. So like one story, to give you an example, there's a fellow in Colombia in Latin America who has created peace zones. His name is Francisco de Rue. People call him Pacho, and he's one of the chief Jesuit priests there, who also happens to have a PhD in economics and is a scholar. But he's a very unusual character, and for a long time in Colombia there were many different warring factions, paramilitary, the FARC, all kinds of difficult guerrilla activities and a lot of killing. And Pacho had a very interesting approach. He believed that human beings have a legitimacy to them, that each of us is and thinks we think for very good reasons, and that it's completely legitimate that it be that way. And he honored people's legitimacy. He said, I don't agree with people's methods, but I honor their essentially who they are. And he would go to the families of people who'd been killed after some of these incidents and sit with them. And then he would go to the people who'd done the killing. And he acknowledged in each case the legitimacy of the point of view and the needs to express. And he was received in a way that was profound. And he created so-called peace zones. He pointed out that a lot of the trouble was in some of the villages where some of the guerrillas' families were living, and he kind of made the point that this wasn't such a smart idea. Anyway, long story short is many hundreds of people became followers of his and honored these peace zones. His ability to express this was a function of the fact that he knew it to be true. He exuded an experience of this. This wasn't a technique. Look, lean forward, give good eye contact, actively listen. He understood the legitimacy of another human being, and when you were with him, you knew he knew that. And something in you changed. And I think this is the missing ingredient.
That's really fascinating to me. And again, there's so much there I want to talk about. Let me speak, I guess, first about legitimacy, because I just think that's how empowering that can be, that when someone's really listening to you in a way in which they're saying, I may not agree with you, but I respect your human dignity. I respect that it's legitimate for you to hold the view that's dear to you, and I want to be able to hear from you what that is and why that is. Not as a technique, just as a real human-to-human type of conversation, type of experience, and how empowering that can be to someone listening. Because to me, it comes back to what you said in confidence. It gives you some confidence that there is something to you after all. And I think that is just really striking, that the difficulty with listening, it relates to our difficulty in confidence. And, it's funny, confidence isn't this bravado thing, I think, that people make it out to be.
No.
There's a sense in which we all have a fear about the inadequacy of our points of view, one way or another. And so when we feel attacked, we kind of we get defensive. We lash out and try to overmake the case and belittle someone else's case. And I love the fact that it sounds like you were saying, at least, what helps grow that confidence in one person is just having the respect to treat them as legitimate and as a person with dignity.
Yeah, it's a bit of a puzzle, because if you're looking at the world and thinking, well, this is a polarized mess, and I can have some level of respect for this cross-section of people, but it comes to them, whoever the them is for you, it's a lot harder. The feeling is, okay, I'm not sure I can go there, because their point of view is just wrong, is the thought in your head. Now, interestingly, I've got a colleague and partner who grew up in the intellectual and spiritual core of the civil rights movement, and he pointed out to me, I said, things are really bad, and he said, yeah, well, I've seen worse, and when you're making efforts to try and change effectively apartheid in the United States without the identity cards, when the laws and the violence legitimated a certain set of attitudes, what we're experiencing now seems, a toned down version.
Sure.
And he said, look, in a highly divisive moment, we would have to find ways to engage with others and talk about what it would mean to talk. Maybe we don't agree. In fact, we know we don't agree.
Right.
But we live in the same community, so we need to find a way to at least talk about what it would mean to talk and to exchange points of view and hear each other. And I think there are many instances in that movement and in a lot of other cases where people reach out across so-called boundaries, not with the purpose of convincing anybody of anything. I think this is a really important point.
Okay.
We're not here to... Dialogue is founded on a notion that we're here to create an opportunity to discover something we might not have known. And if our going-in agenda is that you know already what the outcome is, in other words, you want to show up convincing the other to think like you do, well, then you're showing up with an agenda.
Right.
And you can share that agenda. I would like you to think the way I do, but I'm not going to force that on you. You can share it in the conversation. It's very different from being in a conversation and doing what I call demanding obedience. Often when people say stuff, in some kind of exchange, and end up with a pause, and you can tell they're waiting for people to agree with them,
right,
or obey them, literally obey them. And it's those habits, the expectation that someone will follow you as you want to be followed, that need to be what we call suspended. So there's a set of habits or rituals that we all have, particularly in times of polarized difference, where you have to sort of exercise some different muscles. One is to learn to listen from a state of confidence. A second is to suspend your noble certainties, as a friend of mine likes to put it, things you're really sure are true. In fact, you're really absolutely sure and true. In fact, they're non-negotiable.
Right.
And it's these non-negotiables that, when they clash, create a spark or a fire. And If we're trying to create something different, we need another method. That's fine. Sometimes clashing is terrific. But what's needed is something very different. I mean, this actually leads me to another point, which is part of the issue here is that we need a very different paradigm for how to exchange and talk together, because the notion of how we get to truth, believe it or not, is sort of underneath all this. The idea is if we clash and argue with each other, take one idea and clash it and smash it against another, we'll get something more clear. And while that is a approach, it produces a spark, but it doesn't actually produce light. If you want light, particularly light collectively, you need to do something else.
That's amazing. It's I think that's the thing that people have to keep coming back to, that the clashing isn't working. In fact, it's deepening the problem. And it's not just deepening the divisiveness, but it seems to deepen the idea that all people, what they really need to do is just double down on not just the way they think, but on the demand that someone else just open up their eyes and see. And that's clearly not working. And what does work, what you're suggesting, is actually something that takes patience, because this is a process. If you're beginning by just listening and not even hoping to convince anyone, obviously you're talking about a process that can take a little bit of time, and it also requires some humility about your point of view, about needing to say, okay, my noble certainties, I like that a lot, aren't maybe necessarily exactly the case, and or maybe even if they are, there's more to the world than just them, and how do I think about that? And so, I think it's interesting. In order to find the light, as you say, we have to try something different.
So I want to sort of follow something that I believe is a premise behind what you guys hold, which is a certain attitude of being positive about something. I'm very optimistic about the following, which is that when we are shown or reminded that we don't actually have to be caught in the triggered reactions that often come up. We're reminded that isn't actually all of us or the best of us. We actually can quite easily discover there's more to us than that. It's very easy to find yourself caught. See, the question is, what's behind all this sort of polarization? There's a kind of fascination, emotional fascination with the whole thing that's rolling around here. And interestingly, in people's heads, when these emotional triggers run, there's kind of a tape that runs in their head. It goes like something like this. How could they say that? How dare they think that way? I can't believe they're saying that. It's outrageous that they're saying that. It's not right that they're saying that, et cetera, et cetera. It's this kind of, if you listen, you can see this showing up on Twitter and various other places, but it's rolling around inside people's heads, right? And if you listen carefully, you'll notice it repeats itself. It's a tape. It's not new thinking. It's a recycling of a memory, and it repeats and repeats and repeats. And interestingly, we all have it much more in common than we might think. And we put intellectually fancy terms around it sometimes, and historically justified metaphors or whatever. But in the end, it's a repeating emotional trauma tape that runs inside us, and now increasingly, thanks to social media, outside of us. It doesn't make it, so I'm not saying this to make it wrong, it's just to notice it. It's rolling, and it's got this kind of magnetic quality. This is also an interesting thing. It's got energy, it's got magnetic energy, so it draws it can draw your attention. You can find yourself, drawn into it. So this brings us to the question of magnets for a second.
Yes.
If you're drawn into the fascination of an emotional reaction and the disturbance begins to disturb you, right? There's a disturbance out there and then it starts to disturb you. How the heck do you shift that? Well, we know something about magnets. You know that if you're being responsive, meaning polarized by a force outside yourself. It means you're negative to that force. It means you're yielding to it. Whether you realize it or not,
right.
You're actually making that force a point of control and authority in you. You're giving it, one way to say this is you're giving it power, but it's a little more than that. You're literally letting it run you. You're worshiping it, you could say.
Yeah.
You're believing it. And the interesting thing about that is that's you doing that. That's not anybody else. So the challenge here is to notice that when that sort of rolling thing goes on, and when it starts to roll, it's really hard to interrupt. You know, it's easy to say this now, but when you're in a triggered moment, it's kind of like not so easy to do anything about it. To notice, I'm in that loop. And so the alternative is the question is, what do you do about that? You become responsive to something else, not that. Something that is what? More positive, more full of life, more forgiving, more calm. Kind of almost anything, actually, other than that. And it will change it instantly. In other words, the pattern of reactivity that rolls around in us isn't nearly as compelling and controlling as it leaves us to think it is. And I think part of what we've got is a problem of not knowing how to interrupt all this stuff. Now, ideally, we as young people get educated to know how to handle our emotions in the ways I'm describing. But for most of us, that's not part of our educational journey. It's kind of it's a thing you figure out later in life, if at all.
Yeah. And
it's certainly an essential component to dialogue.
Again, so much there, and we need to take a break in just a second. But let me just say, and I love the idea of the magnets that you're participating in, and because of your negativity, in actually bringing about the very thing that you're trying to shut down. You're worshiping, you're giving it energy, you're giving it power through the clash, in a sense. But the thing you said, I wanted to underline also, is that we think that altruism and optimism are mutually fulfilling activities. When you're altruistic, a lot of studies show that just by giving to others and doing for others, you actually feel better. And obviously, when you have an optimistic attitude, it's easier to give to others because you begin from a standpoint of joy or positivity. And I think bringing that here, we think that part of this process of making the world a better place, not to be too Pollyannish about it, but that we do need to cultivate those kind of attitudes of gratitude in terms of optimism, positivity, and also encourage altruism, kindness, giving to others, not just because of the obvious aspects of it making the world a better place, but these things begin to sort of magnify and amplify each other, and it can actually help us be receptive to each other and how we think about things.
Yeah, I just want to underline also, as we go into break, just for a moment, two things came to my mind. This is Ray Hansel. I was thinking about actors on a stage. Basically, you have two component parts that make up the dialogue, and they're trained to learn their lines and to react to the other person's lines. And on one level, at a very superficial, sort of almost amateur level, you see people basically just sort of waiting to say the next thing. When the actor cues up and says that particular end of the line or does something, it cues up a response. And it's fairly artificial, and it doesn't really sort of absorb the audience and engage them. It's when the actor brings a real experience inside their head such that it triggers a memory, and it makes that a genuine live moment, so that all of a sudden the audience is transferred or transformed into saying, oh, this is real. This is no longer imaginary. I'm actually watching an engaging conversation. It's interesting to get to that point. You have to suspend, and you have to basically have silence in your head. You have to be ready to sort of trigger that response. So that to me comes back to that listening. And also the interesting thing is the great actors have that confidence that they know that line will be there when it's needed. and what they need to breathe that life into at that point will also come to the surface. So it's not technique so much as you're saying as once you really have that in place and you have the skills, you're trusting with confidence that you will engage this entire experience, and it has that similarity and that resonance. It's also interesting. I wanted to make the point that the word silent and the word listen have the same letters. And so I think that what we may need to do is actually is take that cue and say, look, that's not just the absence of words and speaking; it's the absence actually of thought. And you have to have a lot of confidence to go there. I think that's another thing I just wanted to underline is that you have to have a lot of confidence to say what you're going to say, to engage in conversation, and silence your thinking process such that you can absorb the person rather than this is what I'm now going to say next. So we're going to be talking more with William Issacs in a moment, but right now I'd like to take a brief break and tell our listeners a bit about our sponsor, a social enterprise called A Better World. A Better World is an uplifting virtual world game on Facebook that encourages social good, positive mindsets, and giving to social causes to make a positive difference in the world. Players actually do things like sharing their random acts of kindness, expressing gratitude for things they're so appreciative of in this world, sending get-well notes to real-world sick children, and many, many more. To date, over 4 million people have participated in this virtual world game, and they've performed over 40 million good deeds in over 100 countries around the world. Each month, the Better World partners with a different charity and challenges game players and participants in this virtual world to do a certain number of good deeds within the game and within the world. When they do, A Better World releases funds to that monthly charity. This fall, A Better World worked with St. John's Hospice to provide shelter and supplies for homeless men in Philadelphia. You can find out more at abetterworld.com. And now let's welcome back William Issacs and my co-host, Mary Sue Hansel.
Hi, Bill.
Hello.
That was fascinating. It really was. And, I know you also work with dialogue in the workplace, and I imagine they're the same types of problems that we're having politically that you can have in your own little microcosms in your little house. But what are some of the barriers to effective dialogue at work? Are they the same, or are they a little different?
Well, there are advantages to a company context, which we think of as sort of the laboratories that we kind of grew some of the principles that we are now applying in a lot of other contexts. One of them is it's very obvious that the atmosphere of the leader and the leadership team resonates and reverberates throughout the organization. Mm-hmm. The tone is set at the top, we like to say. And maybe we'll come back to the idea of tone, which is underneath a bunch of what I was saying earlier. To the degree that the leader in an organization has the aspiration to invite, to create the conditions, the atmosphere in which the kinds of things we're talking about could occur, then the odds are much greater that that'll happen. And a lot of leaders initially say, well, just tell me the one or two things you can do, and, that'll make a real difference. And, of course, the one or two things have to do with the inner state of the leader in the end. It has to do with the policies and structures they put in place, too, if they're completely out of line with what we're talking about. Doesn't work, for instance, if you say, we really reward teamwork here, but everybody gets paid individually. Well, the incentive system doesn't line up with the rhetoric, and that people will do what the incentive system values.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But a leader can, in a company, can make an enormous difference by themselves handling the dynamics in their team in a more open way, and recognize that it's the way those people interact with each other and the people outside of the room, so to say, that becomes the mark of how problems are solved throughout the whole organization. Everybody actually watches to see how it's done, because many people aspire to have those jobs or to be approved of and valued by bosses, whether they admit it or not. That's often what's really going on. And so you have a lot of leverage both ways. You can also mess it up by talking one game and actually doing another. and that does create trouble also.
You know, I was reading part of your book, Dialogue, and I really like the concept of a lot of what's going on, both politically, and I guess it happens in the work environment, too. I was a past president of a medium-sized company and can reflect back with a lot of this. People are thinking alone versus thinking together. That these conversations are all colliding. People are throwing facts and trying to convince one another. And they refuse to consider other people's opinions. And then next thing you know, people are angry and defensive. Now, at work, yes, it can be modified because some people may think they may be fired if they go too far. Mm-hmm. But so what I wanted to ask is that you had a number of different recommendations, and you never got to how to interrupt this crazy behavior. Could you elaborate for our listeners? I'm sure they're all on the edge of their seats.
Well, I think one thing just to pick up first on what you just said, okay, which is in a lot of places, the challenge is to deal with the problem that's present everywhere, but certainly present in organizations, which is that everybody over-advocates for what they think. When you get into trouble, when you get threatened, when you get surprised, when you really want to make a point, what you do is you advocate. And if people don't follow what you think, you advocate some more. And then if they really aren't listening, then you advocate some more. And of course, what they're doing back is, the same. So you have what we call advocacy wars, right? Everybody's busy advocating their point of view.
Right.
Advocacy is the opposite of inquiry. To advocate means to speak for, advocare, to speak for something, and you absolutely must speak for things. But you have to do this other thing called inquiry, which has to do with listening, but it has to do with asking questions to which you do not yet know the answer. The art of asking real questions is a much ill-practiced or not well-practiced thing, because typically when you ask a question, it's in the form of, do you really think she deserved that raise? Mm-hmm. Which isn't really a question, right? It's a judgment with a question mark at the end. Or it's a nice day out, isn't it? Which also isn't a question. It's an opinion with a question mark at the end. A question is something to which you do not yet already, the speaker does not yet already have the answer. If companies want to make space for innovation and transformation across boundaries and dialogue, we must create room for legitimate questions. And everybody says, well, if you ask a question, you better have an answer for it. Well, maybe. Some entrepreneurial organizations sit with a question for years before they can answer it. There's a company I'm working with right now. Mm-hmm. Their question is, how can we produce solar wafers 40% cheaper than anybody else? That's their question. And they have a technology, they have an approach, but boy, they have a lot to learn about how to actually do it. That's the question that the R&D part of that company is sitting with. What's the question your part of the organization is sitting with? There's so much changing in so many ways in the business world right now. If you're showing up with a lot of answers, you're in trouble because nobody has answers for a lot of what's going on right now.
That's right.
I mean, it's radically head-spinning, including for the people that are so kind of inventing the new technologies. So questions matter. So that's one. The other thing that I think is really helpful is not to be afraid of conflict. A lot of organizations, it's like a lot of leaders are actually quite conflict averse. They say they're all about dealing with difficult stuff and conflict, but the truth is they're not actually very good at it, or they get into battles and they don't know how to crack it. And the thing is not to be afraid of conflict. The issue is the trick is to know what to do, which is, for instance, to notice when you're in conflict, it's because you and they are in an advocacy war. And that what you need to do is inquire. What leads you to think that? What about what I'm saying is so irritating?
Yes.
How did you get to your conclusion? Help me understand how I could do my part better. Here's my responsibility. What would be your part, etc. In other words, things that are attempts to sort of break from the line of advocacy. Maybe that's one direction.
Well, it really would show that you're open and that you are listening when you ask a question, rather than just counterpoint, point, so forth and so on.
Right, exactly. Another big component for both the company context and the larger political context is to understand what we mean by a slightly odd-sounding word, but one that's very important. The word that we use is container. And what we mean by this is an environment in which a different kind of atmosphere and different quality of confidence and different quality of listening can emerge. The root of the word container is tenir, to hold, and con is to hold together. So the meaning of it is, what are you holding together? So a container refers to the quality of atmosphere that people are holding together in whatever exchange they have. Now, what we're discovering, and what we're inviting people to think about, is that in every situation, no matter where it arises, there's always an atmosphere. There's always a container. And if what's happening isn't what you would like, it's almost certainly because the container can't bear what you sense as the potential or would like to see happen. There's a field of exchange, a field of energy, a field of relatedness surrounding everything. And interestingly, we're all very sensitive to this. We're sensitive to context, you could say. We're acutely aware of what this atmosphere is. And you could, a lot of us think, well, you can't do anything about it. The truth is you can. Parents know this very well. If kids are having a battle, if two kids are having a fight, a good parent will know you have to figure out how to show up and bring about a calming atmosphere.
Yes. To
calm everybody down. Because the kids don't have the maturity to control themselves, so their disturbance is disturbing them. The disturbance would team them, it's irritating them, whatever it is. Somebody has to bring a pattern of calm into that situation. So this raises the question, can you be larger than the largest disturbance that shows up in your environment? Can you be larger than the disturbance that shows up in your environment? In other words, can you provide a container for that, whether it arises in you or outside of you? Because if you can't, then the container will be too weak or too fragmented, and nothing much will happen. Now, becoming aware of this is an enormous step towards actually doing something about it. We're very equipped. We're wired, actually, to do something about this. It's completely natural to us. This is not some foreign, odd thing I'm saying. Parents know all about this. Whether we all do it well or not is a whole other subject, but we know all about it. And I think there's a big new frontier here that is kind of in our emerging research and work that we really want people to hear about.
Do you ever do anything about mindfulness in the workplace? Because when you mention the word awareness, it seems to me that you have to be mindful of what's going on. You can't kind of jump in there in the argument or, trying to defend your point of view. You have to kind of step out and observe what's going on. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I mean, we make the distinction that ties back to what I was saying a little earlier between what we call thinking and thought. And awareness is the key to getting this distinction. If you think of your mind as a kind of a factory that produces stuff, the stuff it produces is thought. So we've got all these thoughts piled up all over the place. And, we've all had the experience of driving to work or getting to work on public transportation or whatever, and getting into our office, sitting down, and having absolutely no idea how we got there.
Right.
What drove the car? How'd you do it? We would say thought drove the car. You didn't have to relearn how to drive a car. You had a whole program that let you do a whole lot of complex tasks to get you to work. So it's very helpful, except for the small problem that we are on this kind of autopilot in a lot of contexts, including in polarized battles with one another. Noticing that that's thought in action, not thinking, that's not thinking now, mindfulness now, you could say, present awareness. So there's a famous, one of the original contributors to the domain of mindfulness, you could say, is a philosopher named Krishnamurti. And he had a little aphorism: be aware of thought. Mm-hmm. Be aware of thought. Well, why do you wear that clothes? Well, that's just what I like. And the response would be, no, that's your thought. Our thought creates our world, and to the degree we become aware of that, we begin to have a great deal more impact.
I wanted to ask you also, I think I read something in your book, another way to interrupt things is to actually change a physical setting. Is that something you do in the work environment? Is that why companies might be better off going off-site for some discussions rather than holding it in the same place they have the work and the disagreements?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason is people are very attached to physical contexts, mm-hmm. and the physical the reason is that what you're after is a different atmosphere, a different container.
Okay.
You can get a group of people to the point where they have the ability. This is a kind of grad school level ability, right? They come into a room, and you could say dialogue is a team sport, right? It's right. Something you have to learn how to do. So you could come into a group, into a room, and you could have a lot of individual, pretty capable people, but they've never practiced real dialogue together. So it takes a little time to figure that out. It's quite helpful for them to be in a setting that's unfamiliar, because then everybody has to what? Think. There's no pre-existing thought about how to be in this particular physical circumstance. So for a little while, everybody's in the present moment thinking and interacting freshly, even on around so-called, inanimate or so-called trivial things. It creates a different atmosphere. And also, if you get away from the office, it's a place, it's perspective, it's a step apart. So to rearrange the physical structure matters. I mean, we often will take, chairs, or they'll often be what we like to call the sort of Shark Tank table setup, right, where tables all lined up, and people sitting all around them and space in the middle. And this appears to be a very favorite structure for meetings for in a lot of hotels and conference rooms. And when we see that, we immediately get rid of it all, get rid of the tables completely, and put people in a circle of chairs. And this initially caused great reaction. It was sort of like, well, this is a very unprofessional thing to do, and where am I going to put my coffee, and so on. And we've done this with CEOs, in senior teams, and some very large contexts, and very senior political leaders, ministers and prime ministers, and so on. And invariably, it creates a completely different experience. Just the simple act of getting rid of the tables. Why? Because we're so anchored to physical structure that if we get a new one, well, there's nothing in the way. Literally nothing in the way between our ears. In other words, we don't have a thought pattern about what this is. We have to be present to see what it is. And there's nothing physically in the way. In other words, no physical symbol of a barrier between us.
Yeah.
So these things have surprising impact, simple as they are.
Well, that's fantastic. I can talk to you all day, Bill, but I know we're running out of time. So I want to ask a question of you that we ask all of our guests every week. And in this case, I'd like to ask, how can meaningful dialogue help make the world a better place?
Well, in a world that appears to be very polarized and in a bit of a state, it's very tempting to ask, what can I do? really. And the answer to me is always the same, which is that the world is a reflection of what is inside human beings. It didn't come from outer space. It came from us, each of us. So what that means is the quality of dialogue inside you, with the different voices or factors in you, is the place to start. We all have a range of different sort of voices rolling around in us. The caricature of this is the sort of devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other. We have different voices in us. How well do we listen to them? Do we provide a space that's bigger than all these voices in ourselves? And in our most sort of intimate and simple close-in relationships, it's very tempting to say the world out there somewhere. But the world isn't really out there. It's in here, close in. And the only world you can really impact is the one you immediately interact with. So if you want to make the world a better place, treat the ecosystem of the world around you with greater care. The way you talk to the, lady at the checkout counter or man at the checkout counter, the way you speak to the cab driver, the way you interact with the people immediately around you impacts the ecosystem of your world. It's not like you can kind of be nice over here and a swine over there and expect things to work, because it's all one thing. So part of what I think is an answer to your question is improve the quality of the dialogue immediately around you, and that will give you the confidence and the substance to take it beyond that.
Bill, thank you very much for joining us today on BetterWorldians Radio. This has been very, very revealing. I've enjoyed sitting back and listening. Probably wanted to jump in about 15 times, but we only have an hour. So I want to thank you again for becoming a part of our mission here on BetterWorldians Radio.
Well, thank you for creating the environment for me and no doubt for many others to do the kind of thinking and inquiry that we just did.
You're very welcome. For more information on William Issacs' work and Dialogos, you can go to dialogos.com. BetterWorldians Radio is brought to you by BetterWorldians Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to make the world a better place by encouraging the best in everyone. Essentially, we believe it's just as important, in fact more important, to plant flowers and not just pull weeds. So we focus on positive thinking, positive values, and positive actions. In short, our vision is to bring out the better worldie in everybody so that we can all make it a better world. So go to betterworldians.org and become a part of this important mission. And until next time, everybody, be a better worldian.